Good evening and welcome to Unpacking the Erie live from the UW School of Social Work. My name is Vern Harner and I'm a PhD candidate here. It is my honor to be able to welcome y'all this evening and to introduce our presenters. Before we start, here at the University of Washington School of Social Work, we are on the stolen lands of the Coast Salish people. We respect, honor, and celebrate the Coast Salish people and support those who live and thrive today and into the future. This includes the Duwamish tribe, who are still here fighting for the federal recognition that they were promised by the US government. If these are not your ancestral lands, you can support the original stewards of what is now the Seattle area by paying real rent and signing their petition for recognition at realrentduwamish.org. And now on to the show. Unpacking the Erie is a passion project developed by two friends, Akshi and Shayna, who met as graduate students here at the UW School of Social Work after meeting in my class during their first quarter here. During introductions in my class, Akshi mentioned that she wanted to go on a Seattle ghost walk and wanted to see if anyone would like to go with her. Shayna was really excited to go with. And so the idea for this podcast was then born out of many conversations they've had about scary circumstances and people, along with the considerations of power dynamics, social, racial, and economic justice that are often left out of mainstream spooky content. Since launching in August of 2020, they have reached 24 countries, been downloaded over 3,000 times, and they've donated their Patreon funds to causes close to their hearts. Tonight's event will run about an hour and 15 minutes, including time for questions. So please, y'all, post questions in the chat on YouTube throughout the presentation, and then we'll address them during the Q&A portion at the end. Join me in welcoming Akshi and Shayna.
Hey.
Hello. Okay, I'm extremely nervous, so yes. I'm just going to say that.
Me as well.
Anyways, so I'm Akshi.
I'm Shayna. Thanks so much for coming today.
Yes. Firstly, want to thank Vern for giving us a lovely introduction.
Thank you, Vern.
And thank you to Katie and Brooks, who have helped us a whole lot. And Katie was the one who had this idea. So thanks for bringing us to the School of Social Work. Thank you, Dean Eddie, for supporting this and the School of Social Work in general. And thanks to all of you for showing up.
Yes, thank you so much for all your support. I've been really appreciating all the support comments and texts. Also, if you're completely unfamiliar with Unpacking the Erie, welcome. Hope you enjoy.
Yeah.
And get started?
Yes, we're going to get started. So today we're going to be talking about the Fremont Troll and the Aurora Bridge and some related topics. So to get started, what is the Fremont Troll? Fremont Troll is a mixed media public sculpture that is located in the Fremont neighborhood of Seattle. It's located specifically on North 36th Street and Troll Avenue North, underneath the George Washington Memorial Bridge, also known as the Aurora Bridge. The Fremont Troll is 18 feet tall and weighs about 12,000 pounds and is made of rebar, wire, and concrete. It was inspired by Norwegian folklore and the troll underneath the bridge myth. And in its left hand, it holds a Volkswagen Beetle that has a California license plate. It was built by 4 local artists, Steve Baddens, Will Martin, Donna Walter, and Ross Whitehead. So I'm going to pass it over to Shayna to tell us some creepy stories about the troll and the bridge.
Yeah, so the Fremont Troll, we chose it because it has like some urban legendy stuff, but it also has plenty to unpack around it. So we'll start with the creepy. So we'll start slow. Fremont Urban Legend says that prior to the sculpture's installation, some old-time residents reported seeing an actual troll roaming around the neighborhood, which I'm not sure what this is supposed to look like. I looked up online what people reported seeing when they said they saw a troll, and I really couldn't find anything. I found no illustrations, no stories, just like a nebulous
Yeah.
urban legend. So take that as you will, but I'm wondering if that's what inspired
Mhm.
the installation in the first place. And then also, apparently, every Halloween, the community pays tribute to the troll on Trolloween. So you can
Trolloween.
so you could check that out. A little more eerie. This is a little gruesome, but in 2013, the public found over a dozen bloody sheep skulls in.
What? That's kind of wild. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's super wild.
Yeah.
It was like in someone's front lawn. It was just like a bunch of sheep skulls, and people were joking about it, saying that the troll had a snack, because the billy goat's gruff or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I saw photos of this on Reddit, and they really do look like, it looks like someone straight up skinned the sheep and just.
Yeah. Well, that seems like some ritualistic stuff.
Some people on the internet were saying it was culty.
Yeah. Yeah. It
Um,
seems culty to me too.
Yeah, it was a little weird. It made me feel weird. But apparently they chalked it up to some like neighborhood kids playing a prank. So there's
It's a really
that.
intense prank.
That's a really intense prank. And all I was thinking was like, but like who was involved? And then did they just like,
Where did they
doing that
get-
to I don't know. Did they do that to the animals?
I hope not.
We
I hope
know.
it was fake skulls.
It was definitely not.
Oh, okay.
It was not. The reports said that was not the case.
Okay, okay.
So
Well.
concerning, and also we know that sometimes that's a precursor to, human murder. I don't know.
Yes.
Made me feel
Yeah,
weird, but we
yeah.
are in Seattle, so there's
Yeah.
that. Also, I did some digging and learned that there were some ghost stories tied to the Aurora Bridge, which is right above the troll. There are some stories of a man and his dog wandering around the bridge, just staring at people passing by. When they turn
Classic
back,
creepy.
classic creepy ghost. And then people turn back and they say that that he disappears and they don't see him anymore. There's also a report of a troubled man, like carrying a dog and like leaping from the bridge and then disappearing as well, which is a sad ghost story.
That is sad.
Yeah. So those are some of like the paranormal stories that I found most commonly tied to the bridge, and then tied to the troll. Some people also claim that this bridge is cursed, and of course, I learned a lot of strange and tragic deaths have occurred on the bridge, as what usually occurs before like any prominent like haunting story or cursed urban legend is really some dark history around it, and this is no different. So
Ghosts don't come out of nowhere.
this is true. So the bridge was designed, we'll start from the top, and it's going to get progressively darker, so fair warning. The bridge was designed by the Seattle architectural firm Jacobson Ober, with someone named Ralph Ober as the lead engineer on the project. And Ralph died in August of 1931 of a brain hemorrhage before it even was done, while it was still under construction. So here we are, death from jump.
From jump, right.
Yep. There's also a really tragic accident that happened in September of 2015 on a Ride the Ducks bus. So for folks who don't know, Ride the Ducks is like a tourist bus that's shaped like a boat usually. Usually it can go from land to water, and it's for tourists to like have fun and listen to music, and then there's people quacking, like there's like quack whistles. I've been on one in San Francisco with my family, and it was pretty fun.
Yeah, I've been on one too. I feel like they have them in a lot of cities.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's a little obnoxious, but it's fun.
As a lot of tourist
But
things
this
are.
one was not fun. It was very sad. It really bummed me out learning about it. So in 2015, one of the Ride the Ducks crashed into a charter bus on the Aurora Bridge after a mechanical failure, just a total freak accident.
Whoa.
Yeah, 5 students from North Seattle College were killed and 70 more passengers were injured. And I was reading articles and I found some quotes from the driver, which made me feel really sad because clearly he's very traumatized. He says he thinks about it every day and then that it'll haunt him for the rest of his life. So I can't imagine that I wouldn't feel the same way. I know that there's been a group of community members who have been trying to advocate for some changes to the bridge, like a center divider to make it more, like to make it safer. But this article that I read was in 2010, I believe, and or I'm sorry, 2020, and the bridge doesn't really seem to have changed.
It's really a bizarre incident.
It's a really bizarre incident. And then again, I found another fatal collision that happened just this year in July 2021. So a lot of strange and tragic deaths tied to this bridge. And then I was honestly disturbed to discover that the real horror is the conditions that surround the Fremont Troll and the bridge above it. And it didn't take a lot of digging to discover that the Aurora Bridge has a nickname, and that's the Suicide Bridge. So content warning suicide, we'll be talking about that for just a little bit. And
I
so
did not know that.
Yeah. So if that's something that you are not in the headspace to hear about, then I could support you in taking a walk. It'll be maybe like 5 to 10 minutes. So suicides have been noted on this bridge from its earliest days. Just in 1932, when the bridge was constructed, it saw its first suicide. And then as of 2011, more than 230 people have jumped from this bridge.
Whoa.
It's
That's a lot.
It's a lot.
That's a lot.
And it holds the second highest recorded number of suicides in the United States. It's right before the Golden Gate Bridge, which I had no idea.
Yeah, me neither.
Going into this, it was just like going into this research. I was like, "Ooh, ghost stories, curses, ooh," and then I was like, "Oh no!" Just as I like learn more and more.
I mean, it really is like that for every episode that we do.
That's so true. That's so true.
Like, this is gonna be fun, and it is, and then it's
And
also
then it's
not.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay, this is a really dark story. So in November of 1998, the Seattle Metro bus system faced what this article calls its worst accident. And it happened also on the Aurora Bridge. There was a murder-suicide that happened between a passenger and a driver, and the driver lost control and caused the bus to plunge off the bridge's eastern side onto the roof of an apartment building, and that was really close to the troll. I guess one additional passenger was killed, and then 32 others were injured. So,
Oh my goodness.
yeah.
What the heck?
I know. So, there's that. I was also saddened to learn about not only the regularity of the suicides off the bridge, but how many people were subsequently traumatized by being around it and bearing witness to them. I was reading an article by ABC News written by Susan Donaldson James, who interviews Ryan Thurston, who's someone who works underneath the bridge or worked under the bridge and had a view of the parking lot. And he said that he witnessed not one, but several suicides. And he said that it happened on a pretty regular basis. And so I just like want to connect back to like suicide, not just being like this private, individualized problem between, you know, someone who no longer is here and their loved ones, but also how it reverberates throughout community. You know, just like anything else. But I think that the way that we cover it is very individual, just like, you know, being in this individualist society. So I wanted to share, I found a story from someone who also worked under the bridge that posted on Reddit about 3 years ago. A user named R. James Taylor, who said that they worked below the bridge and they saw one up close. He said that he wasn't okay for a couple of weeks. He said before the barrier fencing went up, jumpers landed out in our parking lot. And it was so common that we told people not to park on the side closest to it. My manager had a suicide hotline pamphlet at the ready to hand out to employees who were similarly traumatized. People with bridge-facing windows, keep the blinds shut. My manager immediately contacted each local team member to check in and offer assistance and time off, which was much appreciated and needed. I continued coming to work and stayed to that day, but I did refocus my attention to fewer things. I dropped a class I was taking on the side, didn't go for evening rides because I was too distracted to focus on my surroundings. I have a therapist and that helped a lot. Eventually, I came to remove the focus off myself and remember the non-reported death of a fellow human and their family. It threw me for a loop. Yeah.
Dang.
I know. Sorry, so heavy.
Why you apologize?
I don't know. It's just really a lot.
I'm not laughing because I think this is funny. I laugh when I'm nervous. So
the same.
yeah.
Uncomfortable laughter.
Uncomfortable laughter.
Yeah. So because this was so common, and the person who was interviewed in the article before, Ryan, said that there was no concerted effort from the city at all before this. And so in December 2006, 6 emergency phones and 18 signs were installed on the bridge to encourage people to seek help instead of jumping. And around that time, this is when Ryan, other community activists, and some political leaders living near the bridge created the Fremont Individuals and Employees nonprofit to decrease suicides, which spells out FRIENDS as an acronym.
Nice.
Yeah. And they advocated for a safety barrier, which is now installed along the bridge. This article that I read also cited a UC Berkeley study that shows that deterrents work. They found that of those analyzed, of the data analyzed of people who had been stopped on the Golden Gate Bridge, the majority did not go on to attempt suicide at another location. So they concluded that this finding was hopeful, a hopeful one. And Ryan also, this person that was interviewed, talked about his own personal connection to suicide even before this had happened. So I'm just imagining like the trauma on trauma.
Yeah, which then makes sense. Like, you know, when there's reverberations through the community, then the community also responds back.
Right. And
they created this FRIENDS, which is kind of awesome.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. So something that I want to say before moving forward is just, I was thinking about just mainstream coverage of suicide, just on the media or wherever you read it, like wherever these conversations are happening, usually there's like a lack of conversation about why someone might feel like they don't want to be around anymore. Like things like signs and barricades clearly are important, but they're technical fixes and don't get to the root of why this is happening. And, you know, I think this approach to suicide prevention is often an incomplete response to a complex and intimate and societal problem. You know, like there's a reason why suicide is higher amongst people who've been historically marginalized. It makes a lot of sense. Like, it does not surprise me that so many people don't feel like they want to be in a society that shares messages over and over about how they're not wanted there. So like, how do we address suicide beyond hotlines and barricades and identifying signs of suicidality? You know, like people need care and belonging. They need access to mental health care. They need healthcare, period. They need housing, food security. People need to be affirmed in who they are. We need healthy relationships and community, like so many things that are actually suicide prevention. Like we need creative solutions to address crisis for suicide, yes, but in general. And I think we just like wait for crisis to be reactive
Yeah.
to a situation. And at that point, someone's already died or is horribly injured. And so
Mhm.
I was thinking a lot about that when I was reading these stories.
Yeah, that's super true. And also like more recently, like probably in the past, like maybe 10, 15 years, there's been a lot of increases in people experiencing like climate anxiety and depression related to climate change and like having suicidal thoughts because of that. And that's also like a major systemic issue that's super real, like what is the world going to look like in like 5 years, 10 years when, it already looks like this now. And yeah, I mean, the hotlines and barricades and stuff like that obviously does not address that issue at all.
No, certainly not. That all to say, it was cool they got together. I just okay.
Major technical difficulties.
We got cut off,
we're
but
back.
we're back. What was last
said?
What was last said? Can someone unmute and share?
So y'all were talking about the need for creative solutions and a broader lens around prevention. And I think y'all had just tied that up with a social work lens that I really appreciated. And I'm so proud of y'all. And so y'all were, I think, transitioning to the next thread that you were going to talk about, if that helps.
That does help. Thank you, Vern.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks for bearing with the technical difficulty. I'm glad it caught the whole tangent. Before I jump into more of a tangent, I think this is a good spot to segue to Akshi's bit about the Fremont Troll and how it's presented as a creative solution to a societal problem, but the underlying purpose was a lot more insidious.
Yeah. I'm going to share just a little bit and then pass it back to Shayna, and then I'll share more later. But I was curious as to like what the history behind the troll is, because it seems kind of random. So I was looking into it and found that in 1990, the city of Seattle asked the Fremont Arts Council to launch an art competition for something to be put underneath the Aurora Bridge because, and I found this exact quote in like multiple articles that were about the Fremont Troll, because the bridge had become a quote dumping ground and haven for drug dealers. So I guess they thought, let's put an art piece there and that will solve that problem. We'll talk more about that later, but individuals voted to create the troll and it was funded through the city's neighborhood matching fund. And the intention was to help reshape the community into something more positive while inspiring locals and increasing tourism. And I'll later go into like whether or not that intention and purpose was actually met, but I will pass it back to Shayna to talk about gentrification in Fremont and how the reshaping of the community wasn't just happening with the Fremont Troll, but with other parts of Fremont too.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to rewind it back and talk about the beginning of the Fremont district. The Fremont area began as a forested hillside near the entrance of Ross Creek, which was widened in the early 1900s by white settlers. And then Aurora Bridge was built shortly after in the 30s. And then it soon became an industrial center. So people would import and export on the bridge and in the waterways to get, access to the things that they need and then create profit. It also would allow people access to downtown. And so it kind of connected all of the city together. In the mid-1900s, a period of deindustrialization happened, and its transformation as a center for the arts kind of emerged, and they
Mm.
repurposed industrial buildings into affordable living spaces for artists who wanted to live there. At that point in time, they kind of coined the term center of the universe as its quirky name. It's got like a bunch of different, I don't know, there's
There's like a rocket ship in
Yeah,
the middle
and
of Fremont.
planets and
Yeah.
a giant statue of
Lenin.
Lenin, the communist, not
Mhm.
John Lennon, which
Yeah.
I'm specifying that because my friend
was like, where's John Lennon?
and then she was like, oh,
Different Lennon.
different Lennon.
Different Lennon.
And then, so fast forward to tech advances of the late 1980s and early 90s, Fremont becomes more popular with a different crowd, tech people, white tech people in particular, and they start to move in and property value raises.
Classic.
It is classic. This is a really classic gentrification trend. I actually wrote a paper about this in Poverty and Inequality.
Oh.
And
It's a required class for our social work degree.
yeah, some of you know.
Yeah. Some of you are probably in it right now.
Hey. Yeah, so I wrote this paper on gentrification and housing crisis in San Francisco, where I used to live. And I cited a paper that talked about how it's like a really common trend for industrial centers to then be transformed into arts spaces for artists who are mostly white, typically white, to come in and create some live work spaces. So it's more affordable for them to do their stuff. And then because this like new community emerges where it's like artsy, and there's like an influx of white people, makes it more attractive to other white folks. And so it becomes kind of like a breeding ground for, say, tech companies to come in and take over. And then, you know, a new wave of pushing out happens. And then, you know, live workspaces become places where tech people live.
Mhm.
It is classic.
Yeah.
And so Fremont's no different. Tech companies take the place of old warehouses.
Which ones?
Adobe, Google,
Oh,
to name a few.
okay.
Mhm. I found this article it was written in 1999. It was published in the Puget Sound Business Journal. But I thought that the way that they described it was, I just like the way they described it. So I'm going to read it to you. They said these days quirkiness is morphing into espresso bars, luxury townhouses, hefty housing prices, and other trappings of affluent gentility. And as typically happens when a neighborhood changes, the transformation has brought mixed blessings to those who live and work there. There are affordability issues for people in the business community too. So like people who had small businesses weren't able to keep up with the cost of rising rent. And then, you know, rents started to force people who started there, who were part of the arts community, out. The people who were kind of credited with giving it its like character.
The vibe. Yeah.
Yes.
The arty vibe.
Yes. The arty vibe. As Akshay mentioned earlier, if you look closely at the Volkswagen Beetle on the Fremont Troll, there's a California license plate, and it was supposed to be a statement against this shift from an artistic hub from a tech to a tech center. But like, it's just like a really ironic way to frame it for me, because I'm just like, okay, well, who's deserving of your empathy, you know, like this arts community, sure, but also like the people who are most impacted were people who didn't have homes and maybe struggled with drug use that you just like wanted to disappear from the neighborhood. And like, where do you expect people to go? So it's just like, I don't know, that line sticks with me.
Yeah.
And then when I was looking into this more, I was just thinking that there are like so many different elements to gentrification. Like I feel like we use it as like a catch-all term for a lot of different changes. Not really, there's like no concrete way of like conceptualizing how different spaces, different communities, and different timelines impact what gentrification looks like in any of those places. So I was like, internet, somebody give me language for this, because I'm like, I know, I'm just trying to like parse out my thoughts,
Right,
like
right.
there's like so many everywhere, because the dominant impact of like Fremont gentrification, which has always been predominantly white, is going to look very different from a place where like racial displacement is happening, like the Central District, like C zoning laws that happened in the early 1920s, and how now a community that was 75% Black in the 1970s is now under 17%. Like that changing landscape is such a different impact than what's happening in Fremont. And I just felt it important to like name that, that gentrification is a nuanced thing and it changes from space to space. And so
Mhm, mhm.
I wanted to offer I was like, okay, so what's a common definition of gentrification? Anyways, Google. So Google says, I like how we're talking about how tech companies are
and then
taking
we're like,
over.
and then we're like, internet is helping us.
Google
Two things can be true at the same time.
event diagram.
Mhm.
So Google says that gentrification is the process whereby the character of a poor urban area is changed by wealthier people moving in, improving housing, and attracting new business, typically displacing the current inhabitants in process. And oftentimes the city or like developers are going to use the term like revitalization. We're going to revitalize the area, which is really just like gentrification displacement. But gentrification was a term that was coined in 1964, fun fact, by a London-based sociologist named Ruth Glass, which was new to me.
Yeah, I didn't know that either.
I didn't know about that.
Thanks, Ruth.
Thanks, Ruth. Also, thanks to Jonah D. White, who wrote a 2012 master's thesis at Western Washington University. You probably aren't here, but your
Maybe
master's thesis is not going to waste.
Maybe someone who's
friend.
watching knows Jonah and should tell him that we're talking about his master's thesis.
So it helped me conceptualize like the different ways gentrification can look. And it's not, what I'm about to share is not exhaustive, obviously, but I think it helps me kind of just frame this, like this whole conversation. So they identify 3 different types. One being core redevelopment gentrification, which is described as they say the form of gentrification highlights the impact of concerted efforts between public and private actors to reclaim the inner core of Seattle for upscale housing, development, and retail activities that satisfies the preferences of workers in the post-industrial economy. So this kind of gentrification is super prominent, say, in a downtown area. Then there's displacement gentrification, which they describe as the traditional form of gentrification. Which is typically how I think of it also, if I have to like, if I have to
what
use
comes to mind.
If I have to use a heuristic. Says that it's a traditional form of gentrification where white people displace non-white households or wealthier classes to overtake poorer classes. As such, this form includes an array of changes from upswing in socioeconomic status to the outright removal of non-white households, or both, which is super prominent in what I just mentioned with the Central District. And then there's replacement gentrification, and they describe this as a type of gentrification that's driven by the lifestyle concerns of typically young, college-educated, and professional class of residents who are generally unmarried, which is mostly seen in the Fremont area. And it doesn't mean that, like, I don't think that the way that this is separated means that they occur in silos. But clearly there are elements to gentrification that are more salient in certain parts of a city than others. So I just wanted to add that context because my brain was like trying to find some type of like framing for what I was thinking. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Akshi, who's going to share some more uplifting information.
Well, it'll start not so uplifting, but then we'll lift.
Okay, great.
But thank you for sharing all of that. I learned a lot from that gentrification umbrella, things underneath it.
Thanks, Jonah.
Thanks, Jonah. So going back to what I was sharing earlier about the reason that the Fremont Troll was built in the first place was to address that, I guess, a lot of people were using drugs underneath the bridge. Seems strange to me that the response to that would be, let's build an art piece, because that doesn't really seem like an appropriate response to drug use generally, or problematic drug use as well. So I was curious to whether this actually did help, and I found, unsurprisingly, that it did not. In 2020, across the US, the drug overdose death rate rose by 29%. There were 93,000 recorded cases, probably more that weren't recorded. In King County, where we live, where Seattle is, it rose by 24%, so comparable in 2020. And this is just like a shocking statistic, but since 2011, the drug overdose death rate in King County has risen by 118%. So that means that the drug overdoses that are happening in 2020 were 10 times what they were in 2011, which is like, even one person, like Shana was talking about earlier in terms of suicide, even one person passing away has an effect on the entire community. And just thinking about the frequency and number of people that have passed because of drug overdose it's really sad. And like, clearly adding the troll underneath the bridge did not really do anything to address that. And also I found in March of 2019, which is extremely recently, the city of Seattle removed a homeless camp near the Fremont Troll due to several overdoses that occurred consecutively in the area. And actually, the deputy mayor, David Mosley, said that he pledged to prevent it from ever reforming. And the way that they did this was by posting signs in the area saying that people can't be there, and had police officers literally visit it daily and move anyone who returned to the area. And this was over 60 tents were removed. And out of that, 12 people were housed in shelters.
Think about what you could do with that money if it wasn't used on policing. Like, that's a lot of money that could have been allocated elsewhere.
These sweeps do nothing to address the issue of houselessness, which is very much tied to the gentrification as well, and the rise of housing prices, and also does absolutely nothing to address the overdose issue. So specifically in March of 2019, it was found that the overdoses were occurring due to fentanyl, particularly a fatal form of it known as carfentanil, which is really commonly found in a lot of opioids these days. So what I'm going to transition into talking about now is alternative responses to drug use that have a much more positive impact and hold a lot more compassion for people who use drugs and people who are houseless than these responses that I've just talked about. So what I'm going to be talking about is harm reduction and 3 specific strategies underneath that umbrella. I and Shana also, we were lucky enough to take an awesome class through the School of Social Work, which is a harm reduction class taught by Shira Hassan, who's awesome. So good, a great class. And in that class, I learned that harm reduction is a set of practical public health strategies that are designed to reduce the negative consequences of high-risk behaviors such as drug use, sex, working in the sex trade, and self-injury, to name a few. It does not attempt to minimize the real dangers that are associated with these behaviors, but it accepts that these are behaviors that people are going to engage in, and allows us to meet people where they're at and give them tools and strategies to reduce the harm associated with those behaviors. And specifically, it locates the problem in the relationship between the individual and the substance, or the individual and the behavior, which may change over time, rather than locating the problem in the substance or the behavior itself. You can think about that in terms of with alcohol. There's a lot of people who drink who do not have a problem with drinking alcohol, but there's people who do, and that's because their relationships with the substance are different, not just because alcohol exists. So I'm going to be talking about 3 specific harm reduction strategies that have helped reduce harm among people who use drugs: the Housing First model, safer consumption sites, and needle exchanges. So getting right into it, Housing First, what's that? It's exactly what it's called. It's providing housing to those experiencing homelessness without asking them to prove that they are ready for it. For example, not asking them to be sober or substance-free before providing them with a place to live. Makes total sense. One of the organizations in Seattle that provides this is the Downtown Emergency Service Center, or DESC. And on their website, they talk about Housing First this way. As the name suggests, the Housing First practice dispenses with decades of trying to determine who is housing ready, or using the promise of housing to reward people for achieving some kind of predetermined clinical goal, such as psychiatric stability or drug and alcohol abstinence. These outdated approaches led to high failure rates and the false notion that homeless people like living on the streets. Based on this principle, it's based on the principle that housing is a basic human right and not a reward for being sober, which makes total sense, and it also makes sense that people who are living on the streets choose to use drugs to cope with the difficulties that come with living on the streets.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
I don't remember who it was. I think it was someone in our program was like, it totally makes sense to me that you would use an upper to guard your things during the evening and then like take a downer to try to get some sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Like it just totally makes sense. I mean, there are a lot of different reasons why people might use, but there are very practical reasons why someone on the street might be compelled to like use.
Yeah. Yeah. Going into more specifics in Seattle about Housing First, Bill Hobson used to be the head of DESC and was the person who first brought the model to Seattle through 1811 Eastlake, which is a 4-story building in South Lake Union that houses 75 formerly houseless folks with substance use disorders. And they provide meals, counseling, and health care without any strings attached. Evidence from this specific project found that it cut the residents' use of public services, such as like visiting the emergency room or going to jail, in half, which saves a ton of money for the county. And another study found that even though there were no requirements for abstinence or sobriety or reducing use, residents reduced their drinking by 7% for every 3 months that they lived in the building. And some stopped drinking every day, and some even got sober, even though it was not required of them.
Wow.
Almost as if you provide someone a place to live and give them food and support, maybe they're not going to go to that coping mechanism anymore. This was also one of the first empirically researched Housing First programs in the US. And I'm gonna just share a story about a former resident of 1811. His name is Joey Stanton, and he now works as a research consultant at the Harborview Harm Reduction Research and Treatment Center, also known as HART. They're awesome and do a lot of cool work. He said that he was offered a space there at 1811 Eastlake in 2003 after spending years on the streets. He said that he experienced gradual improvements, stating, "What this place does is give you an opportunity to change your own reality. It doesn't have to be conditional. Once I started down the road towards sobriety, I was encouraged, but people aren't discouraged there for not going down that road. There's no ramifications." So that's pretty awesome. And now he does harm reduction work himself. So that's really cool.
We love to see that.
There are dozens of Housing First programs in Seattle, which is so cool, most of which have been developed by DESC and Plymouth Housing. So moving on to the next strategy that I'm going to talk about, and that is safer consumption sites. Currently, none of these exist in the US. But safer consumption sites are legally sanctioned facilities that allow people to consume their drugs under the supervision of trained staff. It's also known as overdose prevention centers, safe or supervised injection facilities, or drug consumption rooms. Staff members don't assist in consumption, but they provide sterile injection supplies, answer questions on safer practices, and administer first aid if needed and monitor for overdose. This is extremely significant and important for fentanyl, as the onset for overdose is really, really fast, and sometimes waiting for an ambulance could mean death. Staff also offer medical advice and referrals to drug treatment if they're asked, medical treatment and other kinds of support too. There are 120 operating in 10 countries around the world, including Australia, Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain, and Switzerland.
Wow.
Yeah, none here yet, but in a lot of other countries. And there have been over 100 research studies that have looked at what the impacts of safer consumption sites are, and they have found the following positive impacts: preventing overdose and reducing drug-related overdose death rates. Actually, there hasn't been a single overdose death that has occurred at any safer consumption site worldwide at all. So
That
that's,
doesn't surprise me.
yeah, it doesn't surprise me. Like, if there's people around watching, make sure that you're okay and responding to the situation. Makes sense. They have also contributed to reducing HIV and hepatitis C transmission. They have also helped with reducing injection-related infections. They provide safe disposal of syringes, which I'll talk about a little more later, why that's important, and also increased access to medical and social services. So, like I said earlier, these are not sites that are present in the US right now due to both legal and ideological barriers. However, in July of this year, so a few months ago, Rhode Island became the first state in the country to authorize a 2-year pilot program to establish harm reduction centers, which are essentially safer consumption sites. The American Medical Association has to say about safer consumption sites. Studies from other countries have shown that supervised injection facilities reduce the number of overdose deaths, reduce transmission rates of infectious disease, and increase the number of individuals initiating treatment for substance use disorders without increasing drug trafficking or crime in the areas where the facilities are located, which is important because I think a lot of people who have views against these kind of facilities think that it's going to increase drug use or increase crime and stuff in the area, when there's no research or evidence to show that that's actually true.
Yeah. There's some people on Nextdoor that I think could really benefit from hearing this information. I don't know why I'm on Nextdoor, but my Nextdoor is wild as heck. These people are so offensive.
Oh man.
And uninformed.
Yeah.
Clearly.
Yeah. Moving on to the last harm reduction strategy, and that is needle exchanges or syringe access. Basically, what this is offering sterile syringe access or syringe exchange programs where they provide new and sterile syringes and will safely dispose of used older ones to drug users. They help lower their risks of injecting drugs by limiting syringe sharing and providing safe disposal options. Safe disposal is really important because it doesn't only impact people who use drugs, but anyone who's in the community who might come across these used syringes, and thus it helps with protecting the public from accidental exposure to bloodborne diseases. Obviously, it reduces syringe sharing among injection drug users, which then leads to decreased rates of HIV/AIDS and hepatitis C transmission. According to the CDC, participants in needle exchange or syringe exchange are 5 times more likely to enter treatment programs, 3.5 times more likely to stop injecting drugs, and they don't increase drug consumption. Again, these programs are supported by every major medical and public health organization in the US and the world, including the CDC, the American Medical Association, and the World Health Organization. Specifically in Seattle and King County, there are several needle exchange programs that you can find. If you Google Needle Exchange Seattle or go to kingcounty.gov/needle, it has a list of all the syringe exchanges and needle exchanges in Seattle and King County. One of them is run by the People's Harm Reduction Alliance, which is an awesome organization. They're a drug empowerment organization that promotes harm reduction and safer drug use. And they facilitate and have been facilitating needle distribution programs since 2007. And actually this year they opened their first wraparound drop-in center in Aurora. So that's really cool. And a very cool link between our live show and People's Harm Reduction Alliance is the School of Social Work donated $500 to the People's Harm Reduction Alliance in, honor of our first live show.
Yay.
So thank you. That's
Thank
really
you.
awesome. I'm sure they very, very appreciated that. So all of this to say, the Fremont Troll is a really cool art piece, but the reasons behind its construction criminalize and further isolate houseless folks and people who use drugs without actually addressing the root causes of houselessness and substance use. There are many other strategies that work so much better to improve the lives of those experiencing homelessness and reducing the harm associated with using drugs. And if you're curious about more harm reduction stuff, I encourage you to look into it further, because this just touches on the surface of some harm reduction strategies. And there are different ones associated with sex and self-injury, and also for people who work in the sex trade. So yeah, that's all I got.
Yay. Well said. And it connects really well to our previous conversation on suicide, I think, about not addressing the root cause.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool.
Very cool.
And now that I'm thinking about it, the People's Harm Reduction Alliance, the site that's on Aurora, I think is what I'm thinking about when I'm talking about the folks on Nextdoor saying a bunch of stuff that was harmful.
The wraparound center probably, yeah.
They did. They
They're
got
unhappy with it.
They got it done.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, they got it done. So that's pretty cool.
Okay. Wow, that was very swift. We didn't go on very many tangents.
Yeah, that's true. We didn't.
Yeah.
We stayed on topic today, but I guess that gives us more time for Q&A.
Yeah, if people have cues.
Vern, can you help us out with the cues?
Yeah, are there cues?
Gosh, yes, I can always help you all out. I just want to first say, y'all, that was incredible. Y'all covered so much ground. I was expecting maybe one of those threads to somehow be connected to the Fremont Troll, but it's so much. It's so much. And y'all did a great job of talking about it all. And to me, the social work, social justice lens was really clear. So I just wanted to first say that was amazing. And I'm so glad that this is happening. And for folks, y'all, let's not talk, let's not cry. But I laughed, I cried. There were lots of emotions throughout that. So for the folks on YouTube, I'll still be keeping an eye on the chat there. If you think of extra questions or comments or whatever, plop them there. And I will be relaying some of them, maybe all of them, we'll see, to Akshi and Shayna. So first, Laura had a question about the process, which I think is a great starting off point, and I was wondering about too, because I've never done a podcast. So Laura asked, they said, I love how much research clearly goes into this. Can you share a little bit about your research process and how you organize all the information you come across, and then how you decide to thread it all together?
You want to go, or should
I? Sure. I can go and then you can fill in the blanks. Well, in general, or for this one in particular, I guess we can talk about
Yeah,
in
I feel
general.
like
and
in
if-
general,
Your
yeah.
choice. Y'all get to make some executive decisions here.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I feel like the way that we did this was very similar to how we generally do it.
That's
so
true.
yeah.
That's true. Well, we have a giant Google Doc of things that we're drawn to, stories that we want to cover, that we're compelled to look
Yeah,
into.
we have it split up like ghosts, aliens, true crime, conspiracies, other cults.
Yes. And then based on like some like really broad information, we kind of like split up what pieces of those stories we want to look into. So for example, we did an episode about Gary Ridgway, who was the Green River Killer, and we split it up into like, okay, what's going on with Gary? What the heck happened to Gary? Why are you like this? And then the trajectory of like what he did, but then also like noticing that like he specifically targeted people in this young people in the sex trade, women and girls in the sex trade. And so one of us took on that piece and tried to find information about like highlighting violence against sex workers and a little bit of their like survival and resilience strategies as well.
Yeah, we talked about harm reduction.
We did.
In that one.
We
too.
did.
Mhm.
So that was that story. They all look a little different, but once we split it up, I don't know about you, Akshi, but I write down all my notes and then I trace my tangents, my attention.
Yes.
Actually, ADHD is so great for this project because I don't
Yeah.
have to keep
And
my
we both have
tangents to
it.
myself.
Yeah. We just go boop, 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 boop,
And then
come back.
come back. So the tangents actually really help because it helps me be like, oh, I really do want to learn more about this and then tie it
Mhm,
together. So
mhm.
I want to say it's pretty organic.
Yeah, and I guess in terms of more like logistics, we will like have an initial meeting about it for like splitting up research, and then we like come back to give each other like kind of basic information because we try not to share a lot before we record because we want the other person's reactions to be organic. And yeah, that's kind of how we go about the research. We like do a lot of internet stuff, but we've also looked into books and like YouTube videos and podcasts and like documentaries too. Those are the kind of the sources we tend to go for. So hope that answers your question. We definitely did way less tangent-y stuff for this one because we had time limit. Usually we end up recording for like 3 or 4 hours.
And then edit it down.
And then edit it down because we go on lots and lots of tangents.
This was scary because there's no edit. So I had to be
Yeah.
like,
So,
but
yeah. Hope that answered your question.
Great. Thank you so much for that insight. And yeah, this is like the real behind the scenes, everything that can happen during a podcast recording. I was waiting for there to be like a cat or something, or someone
He
spilled
is
their water.
asleep in my dresser right now. So, well, the computer did go off halfway through, which is totally my bad. So one thing went wrong.
But very organic and true to life. So we actually have a question from Katie. Katie's wondering if you have any personal ghost encounter stories. And then I'm going to tack on, have you thought about doing podcasts about those?
1,000%.
I mean,
Several.
yeah, I got some ghosty stories.
Yeah.
Do you want to share?
Sure. The one that I always think about, which I'm going to give a very brief summary of it because it freaks people out a lot, is before I was more knowledgeable about ghosty things, I was silly and me and my friends played with a Ouija board. Probably actually one of my friends is watching this right now. So remember that. And it was not fun. We thought it was going to be fun and it was actually horrible. And I was scared for months after it happened. And pretty much most of the apartments that I've lived in, at least one weird thing has happened. And I used to think that all the apartments I was living in were haunted, but then I have recently come to the realization that it's just me.
You're haunted?
So I'm not haunted. They're just drawn to me because I'm a sensitive person and they're like, ooh, who is a social worker? Maybe she can help me. But I set better boundaries with the ghost by saying like, hey, you stay there, I stay here. Like I'm cool with you, but I don't want to see anything, or
You
please
have
don't do weird stuff because it
emotional
freaks me out.
vampire ghosts.
Yeah.
Mm.
But yeah, that's kind of like, I guess that I have more stories, but it's kind of all that I will share. Like weird stuff has specifically happened also when I watch like really scary stuff and forget to cleanse afterwards. So yeah, now I don't do that. I do cleanse afterwards.
Gosh, I'm trying to think. I definitely have them. They're hard to pull right off the bat. Also, we do have some ghost story talk on our Instagram if you would like to.
Mhm.
On like one of
Oh,
our
yes.
lives.
Yeah, we did a live on Halloween last year,
Yeah,
actually,
yeah.
and then we shared personal ghost stories in that one. So you could go check that out if you want.
Mhm, mhm.
I'm remembering one time you told me a story about like you felt like someone was in your apartment in your roommate's room when they were out of town.
Oh, yeah, that was a weird one. Sure, I can share that one. Why not? April's probably here watching. It was April. Oh, but yeah, it was kind of creepy. I have like a strong sense of paranoia when I'm by myself in an apartment anyways. But my roommate was out and I came home and I was like, I convinced myself that there was a person in the apartment.
Oh no.
So I went into his room and like was just like a peek in the closet. Okay, nobody's here. Shane, you're just making stuff up. Nobody's here.
Just my anxiety,
It's
just my
fine.
paranoia.
I'm just gonna go into my room and I'm gonna lock my door just in case, because it makes me feel better. And then I texted my friend, hey, when you gonna come back? And she was like, oh, I'm hanging out with friends, you know, in across the bay. I'll be back like probably by midnight. And I was like, okay. At this point, it's like 9 or something. I'm like 3 hours. Okay, it's fine. Making stuff up. You're fine. It's fine. And then I wake up in the morning and she is sleeping on the couch. And the first thing she says to me is, Shayna, I feel like there's something in your roommate's room. I was like, oh my gosh, that makes me feel weird. Because I was like, I didn't say anything to her. So that's like one story, but I have a lot of like little stories that I'm like,
Yeah.
weird.
Yeah.
Hard to
same.
explain.
Nothing super intense. And I would like it to stay that way.
Yeah. I also like in one of my my last workplace, like I would be in the office always by myself and always when everyone had left the building, as far as I could tell, because I used to go up there to check because I thought I for sure heard somebody, like I heard like a male voice talking pretty loudly and like pacing back and forth above me. And then but I went up there multiple times and like nobody was there. And I was like, that's weird. But I used to get like kind of like protective because it was a therapy space. So I was like, oh man is yelling in here, stomping around, making the space not safe.
Ghost man.
But no one was ever there. And I mentioned it, like I kept it to myself for a really long time. And then my coworker was like, oh yeah, the man who paces, I hear him too.
Oh,
I was like,
gosh.
okay, I don't like it. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think I have like a super wild,
but yeah, definitely check out our Instagram live from last year. Because we go more in depth into some ghosty stories there.
Yeah.
I think I tell the extended version of the Ouija board story.
You
in that
do
one.
go into depth.
So yeah.
This is true.
Yeah.
So spooky. And I know before we went live, when we were just chatting amongst ourselves, we were talking about like spooky times in the social work building too.
Yeah.
It's kind of an eerie
Social
building.
work building has some weird vibes. So if any of you have picked up on those and are questioning it, you don't need to question it because
It's not just you.
It's a shared
thing.
feeling.
It's a shared feeling. Yeah.
Yeah. And so in that vein, something that I think is so unique about your podcast is that you do bring in this very strong social worky, social justice lens to it. So could y'all speak a little bit more to that, assuming that maybe not every single person who watches and listens is a social worker or is an activist? Can you
Mhm.
speak to maybe like why you're doing that and how you do that and how it impacts like your process and how you cover things?
Is that your question, Vern?
Clocked.
Okay, cool. I can go.
Sure.
Well, even just like before we started the podcast, because I don't actually remember the specific conversation that triggered us deciding to do this, but we did talk about how we like listen to other true crime and creepy podcasts and how they just miss things that we pick up on, and like don't really go in depth into like, for example, with like serial killers, it's not like these people just like are born and are like horrific, like a lot of shit happens before they get to a point of like mass murdering individuals. And most of the time, those reasons are like trauma, patriarchy, and like more complicated stuff than that sometimes too. But we just never ever listened to any kind of media or like a documentary that actually like goes in depth about those kinds of things. And most of the time, like stuff about like racial justice is just like completely left out, not even addressed at all, which is just wild. Like specifically like Richard Ramirez, like he was a serial killer who targeted a very specific racial group. And if you watch the documentary on Netflix, it is so obvious that that is happening, and they don't even acknowledge it even once.
I've never seen it acknowledged anywhere. I
Mhm.
mean, he is across the board, and also there is a concentration of
Yeah.
Asian women, and it ties directly to his like one of his like origin trauma stories. Which
Yeah.
it's what is it? Cocktail for Disaster.
Cocktail for Disaster
If you wanna
is the
listen.
episode.
Yeah.
But just like stuff like that. And I guess with the process of how we figure out what to talk about for the episode is just like through doing research, like what links do we find with the story, and then we try to dig in further to that. Like another good example is that when we covered the Titanic sinking, we found that there was one Black man who was on the Titanic, and there were a few Chinese survivors, and those were stories we just never heard before. And you just assume that everyone on the Titanic was white, when that was not at all true at all. And there were racial dynamics and class dynamics that went into play on like who survived and who didn't. And just like it feels valuable to acknowledge those things, because a lot of the times when you hear these stories and you think about, oh, I see that these dynamics are at play, but it's never named, it kind of feels like you're being gaslit. And so I appreciate our ability to name those things, because it feels kind of therapeutic for me.
Yeah, and I think for me, I have like obviously like a true crime proclivity.
I mean, me too.
I
we both have enjoyed the creepy things since we were small children.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times there's something about the way that it's covered that makes me feel icky in a way that does like not honor the people who have died or their families. Like there's so much there that just goes swept under the rug. And so I think like telling stories from a different lens and highlighting like people who are really like the centerpiece of those stories, I think is partly why.
Yeah, and
we wanted
acknowledging that like there are real people who are behind all of these stories, and it's not just like, some gory thing that you hear about that's like disconnected from real people. And I think a lot of the podcasts and other things I've listened to kind of are very gratuitous and don't really acknowledge the humanity of everyone involved,
Yeah, feel that. Also, the true crime space is very saturated with white women, so how about we have different voices?
Oh, I love it, y'all. That is such great context. And yeah, I just am really digging the lens that y'all are bringing to this. So we are getting close to the end of our night together. Sadly, this live stream cannot last forever. This is not a 24-hour channel.
No.
Maybe next time. I know that I'm sure that y'all will reiterate this, but I want to thank everyone for tuning in, and Brooks and Katie for helping behind the scenes, and thank y'all for inviting me to introduce y'all and facilitate, the questions and answers and everything. And one last question before we end our night together. I'm building the anticipation. Dun, dun, dun. I think it was Taquisha who was wondering, can y'all give us a quick sneak peek or some hints or something into your plans for the next podcast episode?
Sure. I mean, the next one's going to be a mini-sode that's going to release on Halloween.
Yeah. And it's, I think, our first demonic thing that we cover. So creepy.
Yeah, less unpacking, more eerie.
Yeah.
We need a break from that.
Yes. We do have some mini-sodes that are a lot shorter. We do unpacking in them, but we go on less tangents and the stories are just shorter. And a little hint on what our next probably big episode is going to be. Probably something culty.
Is that enough hints?
That's all I'm going to say about that. It's just something that we haven't covered yet. So yeah.
Well, my mind is going in so many places. So yeah, I will let y'all close out the night, and just, thank you for everyone in the YouTube chat sending in questions. And I didn't see any questions from our dean, but I believe that Dean Eddie even RSVP'd and was watching tonight, which is so exciting that the dean of the School of Social Work is here watching the spooky podcast that y'all are putting on. So I will say goodnight to you all. And that's going to close the Q&A session. And then I'll send you a couple more tidbits from the chat that we didn't have time to get to.
Awesome. Thanks
Cool.
so much.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night. And yes, you can follow our social media.
Yes, find us on social media. All the things. And on wherever you get your podcasts.
Yep.